Hi, good morning. This is your weekly fix, and I'm Smitha Nair. A Council on Foreign Relations report last year declared that Taiwan is becoming the most dangerous flashpoint in the world for a possible war between the United States and China. The US House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Wednesday visit to Taiwan has angered Beijing and ratcheted up tensions between the two countries. China is to begin live fire military drills today, an escalation, the New York Times reports, without recent precedent. Chinese forces, it writes, are expected to encircle the island, dropping missiles into seas only 10 miles from its coast. Why is Taiwan so important to China and to the United States? Will China push forward with its plans for unification by force? What does an expansionist China mean for India? Let's put these questions to Dr. Stanly Johny, PhD in International Studies, author, and presently the International Affairs Editor at The Hindu. Thank you so much for making the time for speaking to us here at Scroll.
Thank you, Smitha. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Johny, for decades, America has maintained strategic ambiguity over Taiwan, an approach that has, analysts say, helped its core objective of avoiding war with China. Then a couple of things happened this year. In May, we saw US President Joe Biden's unequivocal reply to a question on his willingness to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan. And that raised speculation that perhaps there was a shift in its Taiwan policy. Now, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which interestingly some reports suggest was actively discouraged by the White House. So to start things off, could you help us understand how the present events came about? Why this visit now? And is there indeed any kind of a change in American policy towards Taiwan?
I think all three actors, Taiwan, the United States, and China, they keep saying that they all are committed to the status quo, like the One China policy, and the United States says it is committed to respecting the One China policy, whereas China continues to claim that Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan is not a separate country. But at the same time, you see that both, especially the United States and China, they see the other actor as violating the status quo. So you referred to President Biden's statement. So on the one side, the United States says, the White House says that its policy towards Taiwan hasn't changed. But on the other side, there were at least three occasions where President Biden said that the United States would come to the defense of China. So Biden is known for his gaffes. So it could be a gaffe, we don't know. But at the same time, it could also be a carefully crafted message from the White House that the United States strategic ambiguity is tilting towards an intervention in the event of a Chinese forceful takeover of Taiwan. It could also be part of a broader, strategic message to China. So when China looks at this crisis, on the one side, you have the United States president making these statements, and on the other side, you have the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. So the Chinese policy is that Taiwan, since Taiwan is a province of China, Taiwan doesn't have the independence to run its own foreign policy. And China has also taken this line, right from the 1990s. In the 1990s, the reason for the third Taiwan crisis was a visit by the Taiwanese president to the United States.
Right.
So China, on the other side, China says you can't independently visit Taiwan. And the Western leaders from the Western countries, not just the United States, European countries as well, senators and other policymakers, etc., they usually visit Taiwan just to tell China that you don't dictate foreign policy towards us. But here, the issue has become such a big crisis because Nancy Pelosi is only second in command, second in line to the presidency of the United States. She is the speaker. She is the most important leader of the Democratic Party, which is in power. So the White House says that, the legislature is a separate branch of the government. This is not the policy of the US administration, but the Chinese may not buy that. Because when the Chinese looks at the United States, the Democrats are in power. You have a Democratic president. And Nancy Pelosi is the leader of the Democratic Party. And she is visiting Taiwan. deliberately and knowing that this would upset the Chinese, whatever, the Chinese sentiments. The Chinese see this visit as well as the comments made by President Biden as an incremental violation of the status quo by the United States. So it may not be a radical change, but they
Right.
see there is an incremental change in the status quo. The Chinese look at the United States and then see that it is the United States that is changing the status quo. I think that's how they look at it.
Is it indeed, as the White House seemed to suggest, not anything to do with the executive branch of the government at all? The visit of Nancy Pelosi. Why this sort of high profile?
Yeah.
What has prompted this? Is it
Uh,
domestic
the-
politics?
Yeah, could be. I mean, theoretically, the White House can say that we are not involved in this because it's true that the legislature is a separate branch, and Nancy Pelosi can take the decision on herself, and she must have taken it without, she need not take the permission from the White House. She has decided to go to Taiwan. That's fine. But I don't think that she would go to Taiwan without consulting the White House, without consulting the military, because this is such a high profile visit. And you are going to Taiwan and you are ratcheting up tensions with China. And China is your number one geopolitical rival in today's global order. And it could even lead to a conflict, potential conflict. So, given the consequences, or given the significance of your relationship or your geopolitical contest with China, I think it's logical to assume that the White House and the Congress must have discussed this through. And why she is visiting there? It's again, I mean, as I said earlier, leaders from the Western world, they usually visit Taiwan. They go to Taiwan to make a statement saying that, first of all, we stand in solidarity with Taiwan, even though we stand by the one China policy, right? And so they were giving a message to China that you can't dictate, you can't decide who all should visit Taiwan. And Nancy Pelosi also has the domestic constituency. She is known to be a China hawk. And in her constituency, there is a substantial number of Asia, China, voters of Asian origin, China, Taiwan origin, or Chinese dissidents, etc., etc. So she has this. She had gone to Tiananmen Square in the early 1990s, and she has remained a consistent critic of China and its foreign and domestic policy. And then, secondly, she is also trying to send this message. And then, thirdly, I think in the larger spectrum, if you look at the foreign policy of the United States and China, definitely the tensions are going up. And the United States realizes that China is, what is happening in Ukraine is an aberration. In the long run, China is your number one rival. And Taiwan, as the Taiwanese leadership themselves say, Taiwan is emerging as the new front line in this Cold War. Cold War, I usually use it with CW lowercase, not the Cold War, but a new Cold War. So Taiwan is emerging as the new front line. So Nancy Pelosi is clearly making a geopolitical foreign policy statement.
Right. Uh, uh, Dr. Johny, China, in response, summoned the American envoy, warned him that the United States will be paying a price for Pelosi's visit. I want to ask you what that will be. And I want to quote to you what a Chinese analyst told the Associated Press in a report that was published late last night, early this morning. This China analyst says that the response by China is all bluster. Yes, there will be military exercises, there will be embargoes on importing Taiwanese goods, some kind of sort of economic sanction, if I may. But after the shouting is over, you'll see a gradual easing. Now, not many months ago, several Western analysts were also saying that Russia will not be invading Ukraine; it's all bluster. We know how that turned out.
Yeah.
So, my question to you is, what do you anticipate will likely happen
Yeah.
in the months ahead?
So immediately, whether the Chinese would take over Taiwan, I don't think it would happen. I mean, I don't think it's happening immediately. I don't know, but because this is not, the crisis hasn't reached that level of, this current crisis.
Right.
But at the same time, you look at the broader picture, like in the case of Russia and Ukraine. Look at the broader picture. If this is the if the China-US geopolitical contest, this is the most important geopolitical competition of our century. And the United States knows that because even during the Cold War, Soviet Union has never come this closer to America in terms of its military and economic might. Soviet Union was a superpower with sizable influence over Eastern Europe. But you look at China's economy, it could take over the United States in a matter of a few years. Soviet Union at its pinnacle, Soviet Union size of the economy was only roughly 67% of that of the United States. China is already the second largest economy. So the United States knows that China is your major rival. And that explains your pivot to Asia, Indo-Pacific strategy, etc., etc. And calling Blinken just a few months ago called China the only country that has the economic and military resources to challenge the rules-based order. So it's clear, I think, the battle lines are drawn between the United States and China. And now it is emerging, like President Tsai said day before yesterday, that Taiwan would continue to defend continue to protect the line of defense of democracy. So Taiwan is emerging as the new line of defense between the United States and China. So I think China looks at Taiwan and sees the possibility of the island of Taiwan becoming the new West Germany. So the
Okay.
question we ask as students of international politics, and the Chinese, having learned their lessons from the Cold War, once the structures of the Cold War in place, the Soviets never managed to take over Germany. Forget about Germany. The Soviets never managed to get even Southern Korea, right? At the beginning of the Cold War, the communists had substantial influence in both the Korean Peninsula as well as Germany. They played a critical role in defeating the Nazis in Germany. But once the structures of the Cold War in place, once the line of defense is drawn, then the status quo would prevail, would set in. Then it would be difficult to make a military move without triggering an all-out conflict with your major rival. During the Cold War, it was between the United States and the Soviet Union. And now it could be between China and the United States. So when the Chinese look at it, I think the window of opportunity for China to take over Taiwan is actually closing in. And that's what the United States is also doing. When I said incremental change in the status quo, the United States wants to make it impossible for China to take over Taiwan forcefully. And the China also knows this. So if you look at this broader context, I am inclined to believe that China would eventually move in to take over, or China would radically change the status quo. Because this has always been in China's psyche. In the 1970s, Deng Xiaoping, when he proposed one China policy, his proposal was actually originally towards the Taiwanese leadership. He told the Taiwanese leadership, okay, you decide, you run the government according to your capitalist economic framework. You retain your political framework, but your sovereignty will be with China. Your foreign policy would be decided by China, mainland China, Beijing. Your defense policy would be decided by mainland China. Back then, the Taiwanese leadership rejected the proposal. They still reject it. But when China looks at Taiwan, China says Taiwan is the last vestige of the century of humiliation. China got Hong Kong, China got Macau, China got Manchuria, China got
Right.
everything back except Taiwan.
Right.
And China also sees that Taiwan is emerging now, the new line of defense, the new flashpoint in the emerging Cold War. So I think I am inclined to believe that the Chinese would take the island over. When, we don't know, but I also think that not after 40 years, it could be sooner.
Right. Dr. Johny, to pick up from what you just said, my question to you is China's position on Taiwan more an article of faith because of the historical reasons that you just mentioned, looking at it as a remnant of civil war? Or is the position of China vis-a-vis Taiwan driven more by fear? Here I want to quote American diplomat Richard Haas, who said that both Putin and Xi Jinping see their neighbors as a threat to their rule, as they are ethnically similar to the mainland, but their democratic politics and open market makes them, quote, a dangerous alternative model at home. Which one is it?
You see, Taiwan became democracy just a few years ago, right? It was ruled by Chiang Kai-shek's
Right.
party. It was as much dictatorial as any other place. Like in the case of South Korea also. People think South Korea was a haven of democracy throughout the Cold War. It was a
Right.
brutal military dictatorship. So Ukraine is the beacon of new democracy, where all the opposition parties have been banned by Zelensky's government. Nobody is talking about it. So this is a very reductionist approach. This is not about democracy. This is more about geopolitics. This is more about great power status. I don't think, China sees Taiwan as part of China. Taiwan has always been part of mainland. When back in the day, when the nationalists were in power in China before the communist revolution, the nationalists controlled both Taiwan and China, right?
Right.
Manchuria was occupied by the Japanese, and Macau and Hong Kong were controlled by the Portuguese and the British. The Portuguese took over Macau in 16th century, the British took over Hong Kong in the 19th century. So China, but the Chinese Communist Party, though it is called Communist Party, I think it is a very nationalist movement, the Chinese Communist Party. So they look at it holistically, historically. They look at it and then see that during the century of humiliation, China lost, mainland China lost many of its regions to the Japanese colonialists, the British colonialists, etc., etc. And the Communist Parties, one of the promises of the Communist Parties to its people is to restore China's lost status, to get back the territories it lost. So when the nationalists were in power, in Kuomintang were in power, they controlled both mainland China as well as Taiwan. Now the communists are in power since the late 1940s, and the communists want to get Taiwan back. So there are two reasons. One is the historical reasons, because always Chinese leadership, they always sees that Taiwan is part of China. So they want to get that back. They want to get all the lost territories back. That is one reason. Secondly, it's also about the geopolitical status. It's also about the great power status of China. You see, the
Right.
United States, how did the United States become a great power? The United States became a great power by establishing regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean waters, in North America, right? Nobody can challenge the United States in the Western Hemisphere. The last thing when the Soviets did, they placed missiles in Cuba in the 1960s. President Kennedy threatened to go to a nuclear war. Cuba was an independent sovereign country. Theoretically speaking, Cuba had the right to host nuclear missiles, but the United States didn't accept it. That's because the United States was the great power in that region. It would not like its hegemony to be threatened by a rival power. So the China, if it wants to be a great power, if it wants to establish its hegemony in the region, you look at China's map, it's also a caged power, right? Taiwan Strait, it's just 180 kilometers wide. So you
Right.
have a hostile island right now, which is being supported by the United States. So, for historical reasons as well as geopolitical reasons, China wants Taiwan back. It's as simple as that. It's not about democracy or an alternative political model. I don't think so.
Right. That then would lead me to the question on what it means for Japan, for India, and the rest. But I'll keep that as my last question. I quickly want to ask you about the leadership, about Xi Jinping himself. We know that he's slated to secure his third term at the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in a few months. That'll be happening. Now, in the run-up, Dr. Johny, we've heard him declare China's intent to see, as you mentioned earlier as well, through this Taiwanese unification under a one country, two system principle. A similar offer, as you said earlier, made to Taiwan and rejected by the then leadership.
Yeah.
Quite similar to Hong Kong, there is limited autonomy, but you're part of China as a sovereign of China, etc. Now, how real is the possibility that Xi Jinping will have this as a top priority going into his third term? What signals do we have from his sort of vision of his leadership in term three?
So, yeah, Xi Jinping is, I think it's very difficult to understand how the Chinese leadership thinks, in terms of what are their strategic priorities, etc., etc. But Xi Jinping clearly is, or he sees himself as one of the, let's say, era-shaping presidencies, leaderships of Chinese Communist Party, like Mao or Deng Xiaoping. So he sees himself as one of those leaders. You can also see that they changed the constitution, and Xi Jinping is clearly going to get a third consecutive term, and we never know whether he would step down even after the third term. The Communist Party hasn't named a successor yet, so it's possible that he could even go into a fourth term. So if you see yourself as such an important, paramount, core leader, chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, definitely, Xi Jinping would also like to be the leader who gets Taiwan back. And interestingly, you see, 2049 would mark the 100 years of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, right? So they celebrated recently the birth of, the centenary of the rise of the Communist Party. So 2049 would mark the 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm just speculating. I don't have any hard evidence. But speaking speculatively, you can think that the Chinese Xi Jinping or the Chinese leadership would like to get Taiwan back uh, before the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party is rule of China. So I think it's going up on the list of priorities, especially after the Pelosi visit. The Chinese Eastern Command had released a map showing the Chinese live exercises.
Right.
So back in the 1990s, during the third Taiwan crisis, when the exercises happened, the Chinese military drills largely focused on Taiwan Strait, and on Taiwan's north and southwest. So now the exercises are happening around Taiwan. Taiwan is practically encircled, and some of the military drills would also happen in Taiwan's claimed territorial waters. So effectively, China has enforced an embargo on the island of Taiwan. This is unprecedented. During the first Taiwan crisis in the 1950s, early 1950s, President Truman had offered support to Taiwan. The Chinese had to back down. During the third Taiwan crisis in the mid 1990s, when the Chinese started firing missiles, President Clinton had sent an aircraft carrier, a set of aircraft carrier to Taiwan Strait. Do you think any American president would be able to send an aircraft carrier to Taiwan Strait anymore without provoking an open conflict with China? No. Pelosi went there and left. Now it is China that is carrying out the military drills. The United States is not sending any aircraft carrier to the Taiwan Strait. So the balance of power is clearly shifting in the waters of the Taiwan island. So I think it's clearly going up on the list of priorities. So a lot would depend on, I think, how. We don't know how Xi Jinping looks at the crisis and what he concludes, how urgently he has to move in.
So, if I understand you correctly, you're saying militarily there is nothing that stops China from using force, a forceful sort of unification of Taiwan if need be.
Yeah. So, see, a back of the envelope comparison of the military might of Taiwan and China would help us, or would prompt us to conclude that militarily nothing stops China from taking over Taiwan. Because China has a 2 million strong military, over 3,000 fighter jets, and it has built the world's largest navy, uh, surpassing even that of the United States, etc., etc. But there are political reasons that stops China. Historically speaking, in the 1950s, China was stopped by the United States, and China was also preoccupied with other conflicts, like, for example, the Korean conflict. And the United States had sent its Seventh Fleet to the Taiwan Strait by President Truman during the first Taiwan crisis. But then in the 1970s, when the United States was ready to engage China, you know, China at that time was seeing the Soviet Union, its communist brother, as its main rival, and China was ready to be a quasi ally of the United States, the imperialist United States, right, in the 1970s. So those period was better ties between the United States and China. So China was not able to move in and take on Taiwan militarily. So the third phase of the relationship was started in the 1990s. So now I think in the 1990s also China was a rising power. China had not become a superpower. But now I think China has already become a superpower. Relationship with the United States is crumbling. So if you look at the objective conditions are ripe for China to move in.
All right. In conclusion, Dr. Johny, I wonder what you make of, how India is impacted by all of this, or not at all, or how broadly an expansionist China, what it would mean for India. Now, we've had some like Brahmachalani in a piece that he wrote a few months back. He said it's good if China keeps itself occupied with Taiwan, and much of its military sort of concentration is on its, in its periphery. Whereas those like defense analyst Sushant Singh has written about how India has failed to, despite like dozens of military leadership talks over Ladakh, been unable to convince China to go back to the 2020 status quo pre Galwan. How do you see, and what should India be sort of looking at here?
Yeah. So the problem with the first analysis is we don't know whether China would get stuck with Taiwan. You know, it would depend on how successful China's military operation would be, if at all they launch a military operation, or if it becomes a fourth Taiwan crisis. But I think India's primary objective is, when India looks at this crisis, this is a crisis that is unfolding in Western Pacific, not in India's immediate waters.
Yeah.
So this crisis, it will have economic implications, etc., etc., but it would not have a direct military implication towards India. But at the same time, the problem is, if China takes over, if China establishes its regional hegemony in South China Sea, in the waters around Taiwan, if China takes over Taiwan successfully, that would enhance China's great power status, China's regional status, which could pose threats to India, challenges to India at least, because India already sees that China can needle India on the Himalayan border. That's what happened in 2020 when India deepens its relationship with the West, strategic partnership with the West. So the Galwan clashes were a clear message from China that we can, make things worse for you. And India has been unable to take its territories back, as Sushant Singh rightly pointed out. It's been, after 2 years, India is still negotiating. But I think India has to take the longer picture, and the longer picture is that this is a crisis in the Western Pacific, and India has adhered to China's one China policy, which means, you can oppose the change in the status quo, but you can't, in theory, say that Taiwan is an independent country. That's not what your position is. Your position is Taiwan is a self-ruled island, but is part of China. So India has to take that nuanced position that this is a crisis in the Western Pacific, but at the same time, I think India has to make sure that the existing conflict, the existing tensions with India, with China, should not lead to an all-out conflict between the two countries, because a conflict with China is not in India's interest. That has to be India's primary objective, I think. And the effort to get the territories back, or to bring calm and peace to the border region, to the Himalayan border, that should be done diplomatically.
All right. Thank you so much for helping us understand the sort of complicated geopolitical implications of what is playing out in the Taiwan Strait, and following the visit of Nancy Pelosi and the ratcheting up of tensions between the two superpowers. Dr. Stanley Johny, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.